Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Alina, who have we got with us today?
We've got with us today Christian Jennings, who is a writer and a freelance foreign correspondent. He's published books like How Italy Resisted the Final Solution, his most recent publication is Anatomy of a Massacre, How the SS Got Away with War Crimes in Italy, which we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you very much.
This is really good because we haven't done nearly enough Italian-focused history on History Hack. So I guess to start right at the beginning and set the scene for everybody, when does Italy surrender? When do the Germans arrive? And what happens?
Italy, in 1943, when the Allies arrived in Sicily in July 1943, the Italians and the Allies were already in negotiations about a possible armistice. And this was completed over that summer during July and August. And the actual armistice formally came in September, although it had de facto been existing before that. But the news of it was in September 1943, was the actual time of its signature. And the Germans, almost immediately realizing that their Italian allies had, as they saw it, betrayed them, invaded and occupied northern Italy from the top. And they swept into Italy from France, from former Yugoslavia, and from Austria.
So were there partisan units formed in Italy when all of this happened, and were there any reprisals?
Partisan units started being formed in Italy when the Germans first arrived. The fighting in Italy between the Allies and the Germans and the Italian fascists started in Sicily, obviously. As the Allies advanced, when they arrived in Salerno in September, as they advanced up Italy, continuing the fight against the Germans, so the partisan groups, the numbers of them increased. The greater the number of reprisals the Germans took against partisans, and the civilian population that was harbouring them pushed more civilians into the arms of the partisans, leading to more partisan actions against the Germans, and consequently more reprisals in a vicious circle of operations, reprisal and operations.
So can you tell us then, because this is the crux of it, isn't it? What happened in the village of, is it Santa Anna di Stazzema?
Sant'Anna di Stazzema, Stazzema, a small, tiny, isolated Tuscan village sitting on halfway up a mountain, overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, overlooking the Tuscan coastline of Viareggio and Pietrasanta. In August 1944, the Allies had liberated Rome in June 1944 and had advanced northwards towards Florence and Bologna, and they were advancing both on the Adriatic coast in the east and on the Mediterranean coast in the west, pushing the Germans back before them. Heavy partisan activity in the Tuscan countryside, southwest of Florence, resulted in numerous partisan attacks on the German garrisons. The partisans knew the Allies were coming. The Allies knew they were approaching, they were already fighting the Germans. The partisans knew that this was the time to fight for liberation. They knew that they could, the Allies would be there any moment to help them in their fight against the Germans. So partisan groups in Tuscany attacked the Germans with more and more aplomb and determination and success. And the Germans, naturally, they took reprisals. They took reprisals for a variety of reasons. One, their supreme ally, German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had laid down a series of provisions and regulations that allowed them to take reprisals against the Italian partisan and civilian population. It also encouraged them to behave with kind of considerable firmness and considerable brutality towards the Italian partisan and civilian population. And Kesselring had said to his commanders, any of my subordinate commanders who exceeds our normal severe methods in dealing with partisans will find that we will pardon them, we will treat them leniently, we will not punish them. So there was a climate that was an operational climate that was a kind of permissive environment for carrying out war crimes. And the Germans, they had the Allies, the Americans and the British and the Canadians, New Zealanders, Indians, Poles, a massive American and Commonwealth army coming at them in the front. Behind them, they had tens of thousands of partisans. They were trapped. They had people behind them, people in front of them. They were desperate to do a fighting withdrawal backwards up Italy, and they had no truck with the partisans at all, particularly the Waffen-SS units that were deployed into Italy, and very particularly amongst these, the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, whose unit name, the divisional name, was Reichsführer SS, named after Heinrich Himmler. It was a division that had fought hard, committed war crimes in Russia. It had come to Italy via they come from the Russian front. They'd come from Hungary. They'd been on anti-partisan operations in the former Yugoslavia then. And by the time they arrived in Italy, the operations they carried out against partisans and civilians tended to result in very large numbers of casualties. In fact, of all of the massacres of civilians linked to partisan actions that the Germans carried out in 1944 in summer in Tuscany, the 16th SS Panzer Division was responsible for at least half of the number of people killed, over 2,500 civilians killed. And in July and August and September and the beginning of October 1944, this division carried out a whole string of massacres, mainly against civilian targets across Tuscany in 1944, burning down villages, killing old men, women and children. And particularly in the village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema, it was straightforward. The Germans thought it was a centre of partisan activity. It wasn't. The partisans had left the village, although at some points they used it as a base. And Sant'Anna was just full of refugees, displaced people from other places, old men, women, children. And on the 12th of August, 1944, the Waffen-SS arrived.
So tell us what happened during the massacre.
Well, very early in the morning of 12th of August, 1944, and this was based on first-hand accounts that I got from talking to three of the survivors who are alive today, who were children at the time. Very early in the morning, the village was surrounded by 5 companies, by around 300 to 400 SS soldiers, Italian fascist soldiers, and who just advanced up the hill, up the mountain surrounding this isolated village. And they woke everybody up, they turfed people out of their houses, they rounded them up into the little grass village piazza in front of the church. They herded people into barns, into cellars, into communal buildings, into the church itself, into open areas of space outside buildings, and then proceeded to execute a considerable number of them. They machine gunned them in groups of 10, 50, 120. And the final death toll was estimated at 560, which included civilians killed in the other surrounding killings around the village on the same day. In Sant'Anna di Stazzema itself, over 400, the youngest of whom was 3 weeks old, a little girl called Anna Pardini, And I interviewed Anna Pardini's sister, who's now, she's an octogenarian, still sprightly, humorous, clever, understanding. I interviewed her last year. And she was with her mother and her little baby sister, who was 3 weeks old, in her mother's arms, and two of her sisters when they were shoved up against the wall of a building. And her mother and her little 3-year-old sister were shot in front of her. After the Germans had killed some of a group of civilians in front of the little village church in Sant'Anna, they set fire to them. They took all the furniture out of the church and made a huge bonfire and put the bodies onto it. By this time, according to the survivors I spoke to, the village was covered in dead, dying bodies, burning houses, people burning in cellars where hand grenades had been thrown in, people who'd been executed in their gardens. And once the Germans saw that the killings had been finished as they were and they couldn't find anybody else to shoot, they all sat down in the shade and had their lunch. And as they were doing so, it's a very, very, very clear memory that every single survivor since 1944 to this day remembers. And these were children who, when the SS arrived, ran out of their houses into their hiding places in trees, in the fields, in the bushes. There were incidents where some of these civilians, some of these children were saved by the Waffen-SS. One particular incident, one of the survivors I spoke to was being herded towards an execution site, and the young German SS trooper he was with, who was herding a group of children, fired a shot in the air and said, "Go, disappear, get out of here, run away," pretending that he'd killed them. And they got away. He survived because of that. That was very much not the normal case. The majority of these German Waffen-SS men killed. One Waffen-SS man, Ludwig Göring, who later testified to having killed 20 to 25 women by himself. And there are considerable numbers of old people, but very considerable numbers of children. If you go to the museum next to the old schoolhouse in Sant'Anna di Stazzema today, there's almost an entire wall covered with children under the age of 16 who were burnt alive and machine gunned by the SS. And after they'd had their lunch, one of them pulled out a harmonica and they began to sing. And then they pulled out that afternoon, fearing that the partisans would attack them if they stayed up in this isolated mountain village overnight, and back down to the coast below them where they were based. And then over subsequent days and weeks continued to carry on another stream of massacres of Italian civilians, ranging in size from 60 to 140 to 240, leading up to the biggest massacre, which took place at the beginning of October, the end of September, in a place called Marzabotto outside Bologna, where they killed about 700 plus people.
How many people do we think died in the village?
The official estimate that is used by the village itself, by the Association of Survivors, that's been used in the numerous court cases against the perpetrators, is 420 to 560. German prosecutors estimated that if they had been able to prosecute one of the SS officers who was still alive up until last year, they would have done him for 354 individual counts of murder. 350 to 560. Sant'Anna itself probably around 420, all surrounding villages just over 500.
And does that, so if you were to put a number on how many Italian civilians died as a result of SS massacres, is there one?
For this one Waffen-SS division's activities alone, and they accounted for all of the Waffen-SS massacres in summer 1944 in Tuscany. The 16th SS Panzer Division, I would say, did about 2,530 single-handedly. although obviously preceding this period, other SS units, both further south in Rome and afterwards in northern Italy, were responsible for a substantially greater number of killings, particularly involving deportation of Italian Jews to the concentration camp system. But the killings at Sant'Anna di Stazzema and in Tuscany in August 1944 and July 1944 were very specifically targeted against the Italian civilian network that was harbouring partisans, or allegedly harbouring partisans.
Americans actually get involved in these massacres. I mean, I don't mean in the sense of they actually start committing the massacres, but they play a role in
But they do carry out their own massacres, because that's where Lutz Long dies, isn't it? It's a US Marine thing. The guy that's friends with Jesse Owens at the 1936 Olympics, he's one of a load of prisoners that's shot by Americans.
There were a very strictly limited number of killings by Americans and allies of German prisoners. I'll just going back through my mind, there were two well-documented ones which took place in around an airfield in Sicily just after the Allies had arrived in Sicily in July 1943, where two separate American units rounded up small groups of German and Italian prisoners and killed some of them. Those, as far as I know, are the only major documented crimes carried out by Americans. These were very, very, very limited ones indeed. The Americans and the British were fully involved in investigating the sort of extraordinary number of war crimes carried out by the Germans in Italy. To put it in some sort of perspective, in 2016 and 17, the Italian and German governments got together and funded a huge project to ascertain the final number of civilians that they saw as having been killed in Italy by the Germans and Italian fascist forces, and it rounds up to about 22,000. Of whom 8,000 were Italian Jews deported to the concentration camp system or killed within Italy, and 14,000 civilians of all sorts. The Americans were mandated to investigate war crimes, as were the British, and they started investigating them pretty fast indeed. First person they interviewed was an SS deserter in summer 1944 in August itself, who told them that his unit had been involved in mass killings in some of these Tuscan villages. And the Americans were determined to find out what had happened, and they were determined to make sure that whoever perpetrated war crimes would be eventually put on trial after the war. When Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin had met in Moscow in 1943, they came up with what was known as the Moscow Declaration, which said that any men, any Germans, Italians, whoever, who carried out atrocities against a civilian population would be sent back to the country where the atrocity was committed for trial. The Americans and the British were determined to investigate these war crimes. The further they advanced up Italy, the more of these killings they discovered to have taken place. The civilian population, the partisan population, told them what had happened. They came across massacre sites. And so it was with the village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema. Once they'd fought through and occupied the villages down on the Tuscan coastline, displaced people, survivors, told them what had happened. The first American investigative teams arrived in Sant'Anna di Stazzema, as did the British, in August and September 1944. As early as that, the moment that the towns of Pietrasanta and Viareggio and everything down on the seaside fell to the Allies, so shortly afterwards, British and American investigators, like in September 1944, would arrive in Sant'Anna di Stazzema to find out what had happened.
Tell us about the operation on Montessori. What happened?
The Montessori Plateau is a mountain range with a plateau in the middle covered with lots of small isolated villages that sits south of Bologna. And the Montessori Plateau is high ground that commanded the vital access roads that led to the crucial Italian city of Bologna. Bologna sat bang in the middle of what was called the Gothic line, a line of defensive positions that the Germans had been preparing for a year that stretched from Rimini on the Adriatic to La Spezia on the Mediterranean coast. Bang in the middle was the crucial city of Bologna. If the Allies couldn't take Bologna and the mountains around it, they couldn't get through the Gothic line, they couldn't get into northern Italy, they couldn't fan out up into Yugoslavia and Austria. They'd be blocked halfway up Italy. And crucial to the fall of the Gothic line was the fall of Bologna. And crucial to the defence of Bologna was the high ground to the south of it. And the unit that was given the task of occupying this high ground was once again the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division, the Reichsführer SS. Fresh from their string of massacres across Tuscany, they were told to clear out the partisans from this vast area of high ground, take command of it and hold it so that the South African, the British, American units advancing from the south couldn't get through because the Germans would position artillery, mortars, machine guns on top of the plateau and would basically, block access to Bologna. So the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division wasted no time. At the end of September 1944, one of their officers, a one-armed veteran of the Russian front called Major Walter Raeder, who was adored by his men as a combat officer who'd lost his arm at the Battle of Kharkov in 1943, who'd commanded some of the killings of civilians earlier on in August 44. He took several companies up onto the Montessori Plateau, and there was a very substantial fight against large numbers of partisans. And the action was divided essentially into two halves, fighting against partisans and killings of civilians. And the SS said that all of the people, the 728 odd people that they killed, were all partisans. The fact that considerable numbers of them were women, children, and elderly people seemed to have escaped them. And the partisans said that, in fact, only 20 partisans were killed. The rest withdrew, and leaving the SS frustrated, operationally up against, on the line, not quite sure what to do. So they took out their frustration by just simply killing the civilian population in a dozen villages on the Montessori Plateau. It was the largest massacre carried out by this unit in Italy in the war. And along with Sant'Anna di Stazzema, it was particularly notorious simply because of the size of it, and simply because afterwards as the truth kind of became established, it was very easy to differentiate from the German fight against partisans, and just the geographical distance from some of these dozens of tiny small villages and hamlets on this mountainside, where the Germans had just shot and burned alive endless civilians. And Marzabotto and Sant'Anna di Stazzema have become two of the three biggest German mass killings in Italy in the Second World War. The ones that have come since then to epitomize, in many ways, the lack of justice for what happened in World War II in Italy at the hands of the SS. And when the Americans and the British and the Italians all started war crimes investigations in 1944, and when eventually, after the war ended, the Nuremberg trials took place, considerable number of Nazi party officials, SS men, Gestapo officials, and high-ranking Germans were tried, imprisoned, sentenced to death, shot, hung. As the period after the war then got into its swing, there were very, very few war crimes trials for German war crimes that had been committed in Italy. Senior officers, Kesselring, Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers who'd overseen reprisal killings in Rome, some Gestapo officials who'd killed American servicemen or deported Jews. There was a small number of Germans who were tried, and the Italians were desperate to punish the Waffen-SS for what they'd done in their country, and the Americans and the British were very keen to help them do it. However, when it came to it, the Italians wanted one thing, the Allies wanted another. The Allies wanted the Italians to carry out the trials. The Italians thought the Allies would do it. By the time the logistical judicial mechanics had shaken out from this division of which between 12 to 16,000 men that had carried out more massacres than any other German unit in Italy put together, only 2 of them were ever brought to trial, both in Italy. The general commanding it, General Max Simon, was sentenced to life imprisonment, then commuted to 20 years imprisonment. Then his death sentence was commuted, and eventually he ended up spending 7.5 years in prison. And Walter Raeder, the man responsible for the Marzabotto massacre, got life in an Italian prison. Apart from those 2, every single other German Waffen-SS man who had been participated in the string of massacres in 1944 got away with murder.
I'm still like, I can't believe that. That's ridiculous.
The numbers involved as well. It just.
I thought Poland got shat on with trials, but I think Italy got the worst end of the stick.
They did. They did, but not for lack of good intentions and massive efforts by the Americans and the British and by the Italians themselves. All three sides of whom really wanted to see justice delivered. But the Italians after the war were very, very worried that a communist government or administration would come in which communist ex-partisans would take their place. The Italians after the war, as well as the Allies, were very, very quick to see the necessity of re-allying themselves with a newly rearming Germany. The speed with which the Cold War arrived just took everybody by surprise. The Allies, former Allies became new enemies in a matter of weeks. And the other thing was that it was very hard in a lot of these massacres in Italy to find enough evidence because so many people had been killed. And the cases that the Americans investigated very thoroughly, as the British did, as did the Italians, they were able to prove against a limited number of German officers that these killings had taken place. But the kind of judicial expediency after the war was that the Allies basically decided, we will try the senior SS officers. The Italians are responsible for trying and doing what they will with everybody else. But the way, in fact, it worked out was that the British wanted only a limited number of trials because they'd had Nuremberg, they'd done the Germans, they wanted to do a limited number of Germans for killings in Italy. And the Italians didn't have the means, the logistical wherewithal, the judicial system reset up to be able to do it. So both sides, despite their very good intentions, sort of missed each other. And the third most important thing, which was all of the people who had carried out, all of the perpetrators of these crimes had all vanished. They were all somewhere in Germany amongst the 2 million estimated demobbed SS men, Gestapo men, Wehrmacht men, people from every branch of the German armed forces. And they vanished into the new Germany, or in some cases, they vanished to Spain, they vanished to South America. They just disappeared. And when in 2003 Italian and German prosecutors went looking for a dozen Waffen-SS men who'd been in Sant'Anna di Stazzema on that morning of the 12th of August 1944, it was the first time ever these SS men had ever thought they'd been investigated for anything. They'd been untouched since they came back to Germany in spring 1945. They'd gone back to their home lives. They'd gone back to their villages, their jobs, their bakers' jobs, working in agriculture in a small village outside Potsdam, wherever it was. And then when the investigators arrived looking for them, this was the first time that they ever knew that they were actually liable for their actions that had taken place in summer 1944, because up until then, nobody had come looking for them at all. It wasn't the fact that these perpetrators were on the run desperately for 75 years. Not at all. When determined, brave, clever, investigative Italian prosecutors came looking for them with the help of the Germans, these men were in old folks' home. They were living with their relatives. They were living with their children. They didn't think they'd done anything wrong. And they were surprised when they were asked, where were you on the morning of 12th of August 1944? You're actually wanted in Italy. And this is how a number of them, 10 of them were tried in absentia in Italy in 2004 and 2005 for the killings at Sant'Anna di Stazzema. And each of them received plenty of evidence, plenty of witnesses. Survivors and witnesses crowded the courthouse in the Tuscan port of La Spezia, and they were all found guilty. They all got life imprisonment in absentia in Italy. They were all fined 100,000 euros each, which was in compensation. And Germany then, because of the quixotes, the vicissitudes, and the nature of German law, couldn't extradite them because it wasn't able to extradite its own citizens to face justice in another country. So these guys got away with it. The Germans, to their credit, and the Germans tried very, very, very hard to do the right thing, to kind of bring justice to this case as well. German law was just different from Italian law. The Italians ran a military investigation and a military trial and found these men guilty. The Germans started an investigation in 2002 that went on till 2012 and said they couldn't find enough evidence and that they weren't able to bring any cases against the Germans. The main thing that really infuriated the Italians, even though it was because of the basis of German law, is the German refusal to extradite these men to face their prison sentences in Italy.
So they didn't even have prison time, they just got tried and
they weren't even there for the trial. And I'm sorry, but you weren't invited to Italy. They weren't. It was okay exactly when they went tramping in there with automatic weapons. And I just keep thinking of that woman that you interviewed who saw her mother and her sister murdered in front of her, and not enough evidence, and it's not really seemly for us to give them to you when they did something like that in your country. I'm sorry, but you hand them over, you sell them out.
Yes, exactly. And the new successive German governments have, within the constraints of German law, tried their absolute damnedest to investigate these people, to bring them to trial. But bringing them to trial under German law for crimes committed in Italy, where it's not so much that the German prosecutors have done a fabulous job in dealing with, not fabulous, but fantastically tough job in dealing with massive numbers of German war crimes cases. The difficulty, though, is if you're running these war crimes trials not under military law, like the Italians did, if you're doing them under all the different regional, federal statutes of law, international law, customary law, etc., that the German legal system operates under. It's easy to bring an incredibly tough case for the prosecution, as German prosecutors, very doughty German prosecutors, said. It's very, very easy to defend these people. It's very easy to say, to find get-out clauses. And if the German law says these people cannot be extradited because it was a ruling made in 1961, then these people know they're not going to be extradited to Italy, so they just have to be well defended in Germany. And
I call bullshit. They were in uniform. They were military criminals.
Exactly. And they were, by the time they came to be investigated and to trial in 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7, everything, the massive majority of their former colleagues, people who knew them, people who'd been with them, were dead. It was just too little, too late.
Which is why your book is so important. Tell everybody about it, because if we can't lock them up and they haven't suffered any justice in that sense, then we need to tell the whole world what they did and remember the victims of what happened, don't we?
We do, and this is the largest and most one of the most notorious war crimes that took place in Italy in the Second World War. And just in spending a year investigating it and writing the book and talking to survivors, there's a lot of information available to see exactly what happened, how it happened, and how the Waffen-SS men got away with murder, and how the Italians were left waiting for justice. And what the survivors said, they're all old now, they were children at the time, said the absence of justice is terrible, but we want people to know and to carry on knowing, so that this is never forgotten, so that it can never happen again.
Christian, can you tell us the name of the book and where can you get hold of it?
The book is called Anatomy of a Massacre, How the Waffen-SS Got Away with War Crimes in Italy, and it's published now, and it's very much available online, and if you can get out to them, at all good bookshops.
Thank you so much for coming on to sort of bring this even more to light. The more we can talk about it, the better.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have been.
Join us tomorrow when Joanna Valdez will be with us to talk all about rock art in the Neolithic period and how she goes looking for it in and about Europe. It's a really fascinating story, so don't miss out on that one. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.